For more insights, we're joined by Markus Wagner, a professor of law at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Professor, firstly, President Trump announced that reciprocal tariffs will take effect on April 2nd, claiming that other countries have used tariff against the US for decades. Now, given the potential for trade retaliation, how might this approach impact global trade governance and economic stability?
Good afternoon. It's a very difficult situation, frankly, because Donald Trump, he's threatened them before. We've seen them being imposed in the last couple of days vis-a-vis Mexico, vis-a-vis Canada, and also China. He's now threatening to broaden the scope, if you will. And what's predictable is that other countries will simply retaliate. Canada has already done so. China has done so. And one of the targets, if you will be the European Union, and the European Union will very likely retaliate. If Donald Trump does this, and he speaks of these reciprocal tariffs against everyone, against every other trading partner, it will eventually lead to a higher rounds of tariffs from other countries. It'll increase prices for U.S. consumers and for consumers in other jurisdictions.
Now, looking at another issue which is certainly in the spotlight currently is that President Trump has claimed that he's working tirelessly to end the war in Ukraine with a minerals deal between the US and Ukraine in sight. Now, from an international law and diplomacy perspective, what are the legal and geopolitical implications of such a deal?
Look, I think everyone, almost everyone, I would argue, would want peace in Ukraine. The question is, at what cost does this peace come? And what kind of security guarantees is Donald Trump willing to give in order for that deal to be reached? And we've seen this in these rather strange and bizarre scenes last week in the Oval Office, in which Donald Trump, in some ways, goaded from my perspective by J.D. Vance and Volodymyr Zelenskyy had a conversation that just went sideways, right? And the question then is, we now have this commitment by the Ukrainian president to come back to Washington, and that, I think, was ultimately the idea to get this deal through in which Ukraine would have to pay upwards of $500 billion over time in order to get some kind of guarantee, but it's still unclear what kind of guarantees the U.S. is willing to give. It's unclear whether that means troop commitments on the ground in Ukraine. I don't see that as being very likely. And then the question is also, how much of a reliance can we put on Vladimir Putin's words as to whether he wants a lasting peace, which is something that Zelenskyy has very clearly stated that he's very doubtful about in the past.
Well, one area that he was full of praise and certain was that of Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency for uncovering hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud and cutting federal spending. How does this align with constitutional principles of governance and the role of Congress in financial oversight?
This is, again, one of those very contested areas. If you look much more closely, some of the announcement that this so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which is not an official department, to be clear, but is an office within the White House and therefore not sanctioned by Congress, some of the announcements are dubious at best. And DOGE, for lack of a better term, has rescinded some of the claims it has made that it found all these savings. The real problem, in my mind, is that we're looking at the evisceration, if you will, of the separation of powers between Congress on the one hand, as you said, which is supposed to hold the purse strings, and the president on the other. And very early, since January 20th, when President Trump took power, he already indicated that he is the more powerful player between the two of them. So it'll remain to be seen whether Congress asserts the power that it is constitutionally given, or whether it sort of lays supine and just does the bidding of the president at this point.
Now, the president in his speech also reinstated his drill, baby, drill policy to the cheers of many Republicans in the chamber, declaring a national energy emergency and expanding fossil fuel production. How does this align with international commitments to combat climate change? And could this reversal of green energy policy actually impact U.S. trade relations, particularly with countries imposing carbon tariffs?
It's yet another sort of problem that we will have to face down the line. Number one, we've seen a repeat, if you will, of the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. Trump had already done that in his first term. The second problem, however, is much more practical. These kinds of baby drill policies suffer from immediate implementation, if you will, suffer from the problem that these processes and these projects take quite a bit of time to ramp up. So the question really is are these projects shovel ready, if you will? And most of them are not, because much of the investment has gone into into green energy, which oftentimes is cheaper, if not as reliable at times. And that's a question to be figured out in the future. Now, when it comes to international cooperation, the question is apt because some of these other countries will, or jurisdictions like the EU, will have put in place carbon border adjustment mechanisms, as they're called in technical terms, and would therefore levy some kind of tariff on goods that are produced with a high carbon footprint, for example. That will again presumably trigger another round of retaliation by the Trump administration. And so we're in for a wild ride for the next few years, I think, on that front.
Thank you very much, Professor, for all the insights. And we are speaking to Professor Markus Wagner. He is a professor of law at the University of Wollongong, Australia.